Hello, everyone. I am so sorry for the delay. We were supposed to start at 6:30. We were having some technical difficulties, and by we, I mean me. So you have my sincere apologies for the lateness, but we are here now, and we are going to talk about complex PTSD for Mental Health Awareness Month. My name is Katie Abdillah. I am one of the sexual assault counselors in Eve's Clinton County office. So I am in DeWitt. And like I said, we are here talking for Mental Health Awareness Month. Obviously, that is a cause that is close to Eve's heart. So each week we will be talking about a different topic. If anyone has questions, I don't know what my ability to be able to see it on my phone will be, but if I do see them pop up, I will try to answer them, so bear with me here. Just a quick disclaimer, we will be talking about mental health issues here, but this is not a substitute for medical or mental health advice. So if at all this leaves you with any questions, we would recommend speaking to a licensed mental health professional. One more kind of disclaimer here. This material has the potential to be highly triggering for some of our folks who are watching. We are going to be talking about trauma and PTSD. We won't be giving specific events, but just be mindful, and if this is difficult for you to hear and you need to take a break, you absolutely can do that. Participate in whatever self-care you feel that you need to get through it. As I like to do, I generally like to start these off with a quote. So this is a quote by Jaya John, one of my favorite social workers. How do you know when you're healing? When your pain, which once felt like the whole sky, starts to feel like a cloud, and you, who once felt like a small cloud, start to feel like the whole sky. All right, so that being said, let's get to it. So we're going to start out with what I call Trauma 101. My colleague Betsy did a really good job of addressing a lot of this last week, talking about self-care, so I won't go too in-depth here. So when we as trauma therapists use the word trauma, that's a really broad term. That could mean anything from something physical, something emotional. How we like to look at it is any situation that makes you feel that your safety is compromised. That could be physical safety, that could be mental safety. We keep that really broad. We don't like to define somebody's trauma for them. That's for you to do. Traumas can be a single event, or it can be something that happens continually over time. And it usually can end in one of a few responses, and that's the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, a little bit that Betsy talked about last week. I won't go too in detail about it. I highly recommend that you go back and watch her video if you have not already. When we say fight, that, or any of these really, your body is being prompted to respond by something that makes you feel unsafe. There is something in your orbit that makes you feel unsafe, and your body is springing into action in some way. If it's fight, you're obviously going to get more physical and get that threat away from you. If it's flight, you're running away to get away from that threat. If you're freezing, this one we see a lot with sexual assault in particular. A lot of people freeze when there's nowhere else to go. And so you freeze there, and that's your body's way of making you feel safe. Another one, the last one that a lot of people don't talk about, is fawn. Fawn can happen, again, when you're in a situation that's inescapable, and you have to maintain that safety in some way. So what a lot of people will do is they will be polite or kind in any way to keep the perpetrator from hurting them. You hear this a lot in situations where maybe there's been a kidnapping and that person is trying to stay alive. So they're trying to get to know the person who has taken them. I know that's a really extreme example, but that was just the first one that came to mind. It can be as simple as you're maybe a waitress in a restaurant and a customer says something to you that makes you uncomfortable, but you have to continue to do your job, so you are laughing it off and being polite, even though you feel unsafe. That's a really good example of fawn. And what I want to iterate here talking about that is there is no right or wrong way to respond in those situations. Your body does what your body does. You can only control so much of your response in that regard. I know a lot of survivors have a lot of shame about how they've responded in times of trauma, and it's really important to know it's mostly out of your control and you did what you needed to do to survive. As far as these different responses go, if they continually happen over time or that response is so extreme, that can eventually become PTSD. So what are some symptoms of PTSD? Typically, when people think of PTSD, they're thinking of veterans or combat soldiers. That really was the population that put that diagnosis on the map. But it's more than that. Anyone who has been through a trauma can have PTSD. Some of the most common symptoms, I won't name them all just because there's too many, but I will name some of the common ones. One of the biggest ones is flashbacks. And when we say flashbacks, that means you are literally in your mind transported back to that time of the trauma. So I'll use an example. Let's say you are on a street where you had gotten into a car accident before. That being on that street is a trigger for you. You are automatically in your mind, you're back at that scene of the crash. And you can't tell the difference between what is real and what's not. And in your mind, it's, I'm here, I'm not safe. And you feel it in your body. That's a flashback. And then nightmares is a big one too. A lot of the times I'll tell my clients, a nightmare is just a flashback that happens when you're sleeping. It contains some sort of dream material that reminds you of your trauma. And it can be really unsettling for a lot of people. A lot of people with PTSD have trouble with sleep. That's a big red flag. A lot of people with PTSD feel on edge. Just this ever-present sense of, I'm not safe, something's not right here. And that can lead to, you're more irritated than you usually are. You're more jumpy and you startle more than you usually do. There's a lot that can go into that. And then strong negative beliefs about yourself, others, or the world. That's one that you can see with a lot of different disorders, but especially with PTSD. It's one of those events that really shifts. It really shifts how you view the world. It shifts how you view yourself in your own response. And that's the piece that is difficult for a lot of people to break. So, like I said, I won't list the whole list. If you would like to see a whole list, you can hop on Google and look up a form called the PCL-5. That's the PCL-5. And what that is the list of the most common symptoms of PTSD. That's actually the form that therapists use when they're formally diagnosing PTSD. And so that will give you a better sense of more of the symptoms to look for. So what are some of the differences between PTSD and complex PTSD? For a lot of people, to the untrained eye, it can look and feel the same, unless you really are trained to know what you're looking for. Some people with complex PTSD can have typical PTSD symptoms. They can have that feeling where they're really jumpy, or they're not sleeping well, or that low level just on edgeness. People with complex PTSD can have that. The one thing I've heard from just a lot of survivors of complex PTSD is they don't really get the flashbacks. That's not one that they have as much or experience. So, with complex PTSD, you can take away some of the symptoms, but there's also more symptoms that we'll get to in a little bit. The main difference in what makes the difference between PTSD and complex PTSD is the nature of the trauma. You see typical PTSD more for one isolated event. So maybe a car accident, or you've experienced one sexual assault and it's never happened again for you. Those are more, you can get typical PTSD. Where it becomes complex PTSD is when you are suffering from multiple traumas. That trauma is chronic and it's happening over a period of time, and there's this feeling of that trauma is inescapable. You see complex PTSD a lot with domestic violence, and that can be whether it's your intimate partner or whether there's an abusive family member in the home. Family violence is a huge contributor to complex PTSD. And also sexual abuse as well. Childhood sexual abuse is it very much can lead to complex PTSD. Like I said, the main difference is it's that feeling of you're stuck in that trauma for a long period of time and it feels inescapable. And sometimes people can start out with typical PTSD symptoms, and when those symptoms aren't addressed, it can become complex PTSD. And generally speaking, the more complex the trauma itself is, the more complex the PTSD could be. And of course, there's some variation to that. And then it can also mean you've experienced different traumas piled on top of each other. Perhaps maybe one of your parents passed away. You end up in foster care and someone in that foster home is abusive. That is multiple traumas piling on top of each other. That can very much be a recipe for complex PTSD. Just because it's different events that have happened to you does not mean it's any less complex. So what are some symptoms of complex PTSD? Like I said before, you can have some of the typical symptoms, but there's also many more that can happen. These symptoms I'm referencing have been highly researched and dialogued by amazing researchers who've done the work. The ones I'm pulling from today are Pete Walker and Christine Courtois. Sorry, I don't have a spelling for that last name. The first one we're going to talk about is emotional flashbacks. Most complex PTSD clients, like I've said, are not having those I'm in the moment again flashbacks. That's not happening for them. So when they hear about it, that's very confusing for them. And they'll describe it as, I'll feel a feeling that I was there, but I don't feel physically there. And when we talk about emotional flashbacks, that's what we mean. You're in that trigger situation and you have that feeling of fear or anxiety or stress or sadness or anger, whatever that feeling is. And whereas a typical flashback will maybe be over with in a few minutes, emotional flashbacks can last a long time. They can last hours, days. It really varies. And then the next one is self-abandonment. Another word that a lot of people use to describe this is self-betrayal. And what that can mean is you either don't have a sense of what your needs are, or you know what your needs are and you just can't get yourself to meet them. That can mean anything from I'm hungry, but I'm waiting several hours to eat, or it could mean surrounding yourself with unsafe people. It can really go from one end to the other of the spectrum there. And the core thought process that comes with that is, I'm not worthy of being taken care of. I'm not worthy of having needs. I don't know what my needs are, and I can't take care of myself. Those are some of the main thoughts that come from that. And a lot of times that comes from abuse. You've been systematically taught that your needs and your thoughts don't matter. And that that it really isn't true. But when you've been in that situation for so long, it's so easy to think that and to stay in that thinking because it's all you've ever known. The next one, and this kind of stems off that self-abandonment too, is a vicious inner critic. And what I mean when I say that is you are really, really good at beating yourself up mentally. If there's a single thing that you've done wrong, it's you are critiquing yourself time and time again. And you just have that ever-present sense of, I'm not good enough, I can't do this, I'm not worthy. And that impacts how you critique yourself. And that can stem from feelings of our next one, which is toxic shame. That one is, a lot of the times the shame is related to the trauma. So it can be, you have some sort of feeling of shame that's buried deep in that trauma, whatever that may be. The next one is social anxiety. And I want to make a distinction here between people who have social anxiety and people who have the social anxiety of complex PTSD. They can be two different things. People with complex PTSD have social anxiety because they have been taught that the world is not safe for them. They have been taught that it's not okay to be who they are. And so that makes them really fearful of people. It makes them view themselves as a walking target. I've had people say to me, I feel like I'm walking around with a target on my back, and people are just waiting to get me. That is that social anxiety piece, the fear of being attacked, the fear of being criticized by others, the fear that they will start to treat you like maybe abuser has. Probably the biggest one that I see with complex trauma is dissociation. That seems like a really big scientific word, but I promise you probably know what it is. Dissociation is the feeling of not being present in your body. So I'll give you an example. Let's say it's gonna be difficult to imagine here, but imagine that you are driving home from work one day. I know it's probably been a while since some of us have been in a car, but bear with me here. You're driving home from work and all of a sudden you're home and you have no idea how you got there. You just were not emotionally present in the car, and you get out of the car and you're like, what just happened? That's dissociation. That is not being present in your body. That's, of course, like a really benign way of dissociating. We all dissociate from time to time, but for someone with complex PTSD, that dissociation is their way of life. They are getting through the world by dissociating. When things get hard, they're shutting that brain off and saying, this is what I need to do. I can't be present. This is too hard. And it's because they've learned that this is the only way they have to survive. When this happens with people who have gone through child abuse, in some ways this can make them resilient because that's how they're surviving, is they just have to shut it off and not be present. Because if they were present for some of those things, that pain would be unimaginable. So we really try to see that as that's how you're trying to survive. And it can feel really scary. The next one is trouble regulating extreme emotions. That basically means you get amped up really easy and you can't come down. You're staying amped up here. You're feeling that heartbeat going fast. You're feeling that sweat. All those things that happen to you in a fight or flight response. You're feeling that constantly. It's a cycle of I'm feeling amped up and then I'm crashing. I'm amped up and then I'm crashing. And it's anytime there's a difficult emotion, that's where you're going. You're going right there. Our next one is having a complicated view of relationships. This one, I'll break this one down a little bit. When you are around an abusive person, whether that's a family member, whether that's a spouse, whether that's a peer, that impacts how you view relationships. And when you are a child growing up in that, or that's all you've ever known, you have a really hard time knowing what is safe and what is not. Who is a safe person and who is not. It doesn't even occur to you that there's a such thing as healthy and unhealthy relationships, and you wouldn't know what a healthy relationship looks like. You've never seen one. And, that can lead to people are spending time with unsafe people and not realizing that that's triggering them. Another way of putting this, I've had a lot of clients say this to me, is I feel like my abuser is in my head. He's always in the back of my head, and he's always got his little comments. And he's saying things like, you think you can do that? You think that's okay? Just that constant critiquing, policing their behavior in their head all the time. And that impacts your relationships too. You think every relationship is going to be like that because you've always got that inner critic in your head. And the last big one we'll talk about is a changed sense of meaning. I think a lot of people go through life, when we think about the golden rule, that is, treat people how you want to be treated, but then also we think about good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. And so when we think about trauma, the simplest way to put trauma, for the most part, trauma is bad things happening to good people. And so that is really confusing to someone who has grown up thinking, if I'm a good person, then I'll stay safe. And trauma shatters that for people. And so that changes that sense of meaning, and it tells people, I must have been a bad person. I must have deserved what happened to me, even in situations where it doesn't make sense, especially when it doesn't make sense. And another big piece of this is we get what's called moral injury. And that is, when you've been through a trauma or in the process of a trauma, you may find yourself doing things that you never thought you would do. We hear this a lot from our sexual assault survivors who, maybe they were assaulted at a party and they had drank more than they planned on drinking. And so they'll say to themselves, oh, I really wish I wouldn't have done that. I normally do not drink like that. I was not myself. And if I had not drank that much, I wouldn't have been assaulted. And they view that trauma as a punishment for having done something out of the norm for them. And it's so incredibly difficult to watch and to deal with. There's a lot of shame that comes from that. And, for anybody who's watching right now, if you're feeling that way, just reassure yourself and tell yourself, I did what I needed to do to survive. There's nothing that could have made me a target. There's nothing that could have made me deserving of what I went through. I did what I needed to do to survive. So that's the last big one. And then just a few other symptoms that I want to talk about too. These can happen with typical PTSD and complex PTSD, but I just wanted to highlight them too. Probably the biggest one in this group is suicidal thoughts or suicide attempts. That's a big one. You can see it, like I said, with typical PTSD too, but with complex PTSD, you're thinking that way all the time, or you've had multiple attempts. Very, very common. A lot of survivors with complex PTSD will say they'll almost have suicide as an option that's always tucked away in the back of their head. And it feels like, if it's not any better by this day, then I'll kill myself. Or if this doesn't get better, it's always an option for them. And then that can kind of transition into self-harm. Self-harm is a piece too. And the reason why I put that separately is because you can have self-harm without being suicidal. Some people self-harm just to try and regulate themselves or understand what has happened to them in some visceral way in your body. And so that's a big one too. A lot of people with complex PTSD will use substances to numb what they're feeling. When you've got that feeling of being jacked up in your body all the time, you've got to bring that down at some point. And so for a lot of people, that comes to resorting to substances. anyone who's worked with trauma for a long time will tell you, a lot of people with addiction have a traumatic past, and that's because that's the way that they've found to deal with it. It's a way to almost regulate their nervous system. It's a way to check out. It's a way to not deal with what's been going on. When you have no other tools, that's what you resort to. And if you are experiencing any of those things, I just want you to know you're not alone. These are so common. These lists of symptoms exist for a reason. You are not abnormal. You are a person who's been through some abnormal experiences, and you're impacted by them. And there's nothing wrong with you because of that. So I just wanted to normalize that really quickly. So as I'm coming to a close here, I'll just talk really quickly. How do you heal from complex PTSD? What does that healing look like? And this can be a few different things. I think a big piece of it, first of all, is recognizing it for what it is, just naming it, giving it a name, and not as a label to define yourself and say, I have complex PTSD, but as a way to say, this is why I feel what I'm feeling, this is why I'm experiencing it this way, because this happened to me. That those names have power, and that can give you power over your circumstances. And with complex PTSD, a lot of the times you've been through so much trauma, you don't even know that it's trauma. It just feels normal to you. And so once you have that understanding of this is not normal, that's when things can start to move and change. The next piece is, in some way, learning to be safe in your own body. That is so important. I've had many people come into my office and say, I've never felt safe in my body. I've never felt safe anywhere. Or if they have felt safe, the first time they're experiencing safety is in my office. And as a person who witnesses that, I'm in awe that someone has survived going that long not feeling safe. So I just want to take a second to honor people who feel that way. You know, you are so resilient. But a piece of that healing is finding that safety somewhere. As far as that goes, that can include a lot of the self-care piece. Like I said, my colleague addressed that probably better than I ever could. So I highly recommend going back and looking at that video. And then also, working on this with a therapist. Trauma therapists are trained to help you regain that sense of safety. There's lots of different exercises that you can do to help achieve that. And my third one, of course, going along with what I'm already saying, is therapy. Can people address complex trauma without therapy in their own way? I'm sure it's possible. But our goal with therapy is to make that step easier for you and to just be a supportive, unbiased person who's there to teach you, to listen to you, to not judge you, and just to walk alongside you as you heal. It's really important. And then the last piece is having some sort of safe relationship, whatever that relationship is. It can be with a parent, it can be with a partner, a friend. For some people, that first safe person they've ever met in their life is their therapist, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. All it can take is one person to make that difference and to say, you know what? You've been through some stuff. I see you. I believe you. I know that you're telling the truth, and I'm going to stick with you through this, and I'm going to do what I can to give you what you need as your person. And that is so incredibly healing for so many people. I can't discount that. I can't express that enough. Having some sort of safe relationship is so important. Yeah, so that is all I have for you guys. Thank you so much for listening in. I know this is a lot of material we covered in not a lot of time. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. If this has brought up some stuff for you and you just want to talk to somebody, feel free to contact us. Contact us at our crisis line, and we will help you in any way that we can, even if it means just referring you to somebody who has the expertise to face what you're dealing with you. So again, any questions, please let us know. And thank you again for taking your Friday night to be here with me. Take care and stay safe.